was recording. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your presence here, people who are here, and online too. First of all, I want to introduce Professor Annah Lake Zhu. She's a assistant professor of environmental policy and University of the Netherlands. She worked at the UN Environmental Program in Genebra and was a Peace Corps fund here in Madagascar. And her work has been published in Science, and Political Geography. She is here yesterday for this weekend, and today she is going to present with her research about the whole school. So we're telling you to maybe thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. And we give you thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. I'm coming from the Netherlands, but I'm from the US. Initially, I've been living in the Netherlands for 4 years, working as a professor there. So today I'm going to talk about Rosewood, which is based on my book. It came out in 2022, and the book is based on my PhD research. The title, Rosewood Endangered Species Conservation and the Rise of Global China. So it's really a case study of Chinese demand for rosewood and rosewood furniture. Rosewood is a group of tropical hardwoods that grow across the tropics in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. Brazilian rosewood is very famous, but we won't be talking that much about that. One of the most expensive types of rosewood demanded in China is found in Madagascar. And that's what my research mostly focuses on. The book is based on fieldwork that I did both in Madagascar and China between 2014 and 2018. And during that time, I went to the forests of Madagascar where rosewood is cut illegally and then shipped to China. I also went to China to the timber markets where they sell it, and to the furniture manufacturers where they manufacture it into furniture. And the book it's academic, but for me, it's also very personal. It's based on my time living in Madagascar as a Peace Corps volunteer, and many trips that I've taken to China since 2005. My husband to China, he was born there, his family lives there, and we've visited there since 2005 and saw how China has really transformed since that point in time. And the idea with the book is to use the case of rosewood to better understand Chinese demand for endangered species, both in terms of why China's demand for endangered species has grown so much in the past 2 decades, and also what to do about it at the global level. And the book begins, like all good books, with an art heist. Here we have Drottningholm Palace, the royal residence of the King of Sweden, and it contains many priceless artifacts from around the world, including from China. This is in fact a Chinese pavilion. And back in 2010, a group of thieves broke in here on a very specific mission. They didn't steal just anything. They stole 6 very specific works of Chinese art, leaving everything else behind. So they went in, they triggered the alarm, and within 6 minutes, the police arrived, but the thieves were gone, disappeared into the night. This theft was the beginning of a chain of thefts in which specifically Chinese artifacts and antiques that had been taken out of China by Western powers in the previous century had been targeted and stolen. And this type of heist, which targets only Chinese items like this, became so prominent in the 2010s that some museums began voluntarily actually repatriating their Chinese possessions, so as to not be targeted. So what's going on here? From a Western perspective, these thefts make no sense, right? The artworks are very well known that they couldn't resell them through the normal channels we use to resell stolen art. But it's true only in the West. Outside of the West, and certainly in China, the same works of art could indeed be sold and displayed proudly. And that's because they're not considered necessarily thefts, but in fact repatriations. The things are stolen, they're considered rightfully belonging to China. And not only that, but there's plenty of money to be made with these thefts, given China's booming markets in historical cultural objects. So not only could they be displayed, they would grow in value, these particular items. They're in fact one of the most promising avenues for investment in contemporary China. And this is where we see the link with endangered species. There's a similar link in terms of the propensity for appreciation. These markets for endangered species are booming since 2005, since 2010, and they've turned into speculative commodities. So pangolin scales can be worth more than silver, rhino horn worth more than diamond, and rosewood, this is rosewood from Madagascar. The most expensive types, which are not from Madagascar, but from China that are now basically commercially extinct, can be worth their weight in gold. And you've probably heard about rhino horn and pangolin, ivory for sure, less so about rosewood and its uses in China. But rosewood is arguably more important because it's trafficked far more than these other species in terms of value. So if we look at this graph here, it's the different species, different groups of species, and their confiscation data on these species and how much each percentage is worth according to the value. And rosewood we see is in fact the most illicitly trafficked species. So this data is from 2005 to 2014. And during that time, rosewood accounted for 35% of all illicitly traded endangered species by value. That's more than rhino horn, ivory, and big cats combined, based on this data. And basically all the rosewood is being exported to China. Since about 2000, the rosewood has been exported to China to become this. This is a particular style of furniture that dates back to the Ming and Qing dynasties in China. And this rosewood, here we see rosewood coming from Southeast Asia. You can see it's a different color than different type of wood than that from Madagascar. But from many different countries across 3 continents, rosewood is being imported and sent to China, destined to become this type of furniture. In 2014, the market for this type of furniture was worth $26 billion in China. I mean, this is huge. This is, if we compare it to China's luxury fashion market, which were $8 billion in 2021, you see it far surpasses that. So more than Louis Vuitton handbags or Rolex watches, China's nouveau riche are buying the traditional rosewood furniture. And it's being sold in huge mega malls such as this. This is a mall exclusively dedicated to the sale of rosewood furniture. Wow. So here in this presentation, we're going to explore this booming market and demand for endangered species in China, using the case of rosewood in particular. And what we'll see is that demand for rosewood is illustrative of what demand for endangered species means in China for these culturally important endangered species, in terms of it being both culturally historical, but also a very good financial opportunity in the present moment, and a highly speculative commodity. And the goal, and you'll see throughout the presentation, is to look at both on the demand side in China, but also the supply side in Madagascar, what's going on, and to really traverse these different worlds, because that's precisely what my research did. In the forests of Madagascar, talking with loggers, and then going to the furniture manufacturers, and then to the malls and shops where rosewood is sold. So the goal is to kind of bring these 2 sides of the story together. We'll do so in 4 parts. First, I'll discuss the cultural history of rosewood in Madagascar, looking at the past to understand contemporary demand. Then we'll go to Madagascar and look at the impacts in the forest, how China's booming markets are affecting the people in the forests in Madagascar. And then in the third section, I want to think kind of more conceptually about protectionism versus plantations, that this debate about how to conserve rosewood. And then in the last section, to kind of think about the global implications of this, outside of rosewood, outside of even endangered species, how should we be thinking about China as a global actor, both in terms of consuming endangered species on a large scale, but also in terms of beginning to conserve endangered species, beginning to engage in environmental activity. What does that mean? What are the global implications? So that's what we'll talk about today. We'll start with the cultural history of rosewood in China. This is a picture that I took from Beijing's Forbidden House, rosewood that's on display. And again, I said it's dates back to the Ming Dynasty, to the late 14th century. And during this time, rosewood was considered one of the foremost symbols of social status in China. It was commissioned by emperors, used by the elites. China's imperial literati would have rosewood desks and chairs in their studies, rosewood armoires, rosewood dining sets such as this. Not unlike other items made from endangered species, such as ivory decorations, rhino horn goblet. This particular goblet was one of the 6 stolen items from the trotting hole that I mentioned in the beginning, made of rhino horn, right? Modern consumers of endangered species are buying into this cultural history, and it's really the history that is making these, and the memory of this history that's making these items so valuable. But it's not just the history. It's not just the imperial history, it's also China's modern history. So nearly 50 years after the fall of the Qing dynasty, starting in 1966, China had the Cultural Revolution. From 1966 to 1976, Mao Zedong led a cultural revolution that essentially upended Chinese society. Right? The goal was to purge all traditional and counter-revolutionary thinking from the country and establish Maoist thought as the sole political and social ideology. And here we see pictures from the revolution, the few that remain. Schools and universities were closed during this time, books burned, assets seized. A generation of bourgeois youth were sent down to provincial rural farms to be re-educated. And during this time, all cultural traditions, including the use and consumption of rosewood and endangered species, were abandoned, were stigmatized, and we see a sharp devaluation of these traditional landmarks. They were confiscated. Rosewood furniture was occasionally burned in the streets or destroyed or sent off to rural farms used as chopping blocks. All of these items became radically stigmatized and practically worthless. But now today, starting in the 1990s and after that, we see another reversal in the value of rosewood. Rosewood and other cultural goods are being bought back by individuals who endured the hardship of the Cultural Revolution. Families that may have had their rosewood furniture stolen have begun buying it back at malls such as this. This is another 6-story mall devoted exclusively to the sale of rosewood furniture in China. An entirely different one, right? And this is where that $26 billion market is coming from. But the point here is that the appeal is both cultural. It has this cultural history and this memory of confiscation and loss, but it's also become financial, right? So these malls are becoming places like the speculative investment. It's true for rosewood, it's true for ivory, it's true for rhino horn. It's not just because they're endangered species, but they're cultural artifacts with a strong potential for financial appreciation. This is an example of another cultural artifact in China. In 2014, this what's called a chicken cup that was looted from Beijing's Imperial Summer Palace and sold for $36 million US. And who bought this chicken cup? It was a taxi driver turned billionaire. And after he bought it, this is what the headline refers to. He drank water from it in front of a stunned crowd. And everyone was shocked. He just spent $36 million and then drank water from it. This was like the height of taxi drivers turned billionaires. People, the wealth and the idea that these cultural items would grow in value. So the demand is both cultural and financial. It builds on the history of the Cultural Revolution and the post-Mao era. And then thus we get this wave of people either buying back or stealing back, in some cases, this lost cultural heritage. So then if we look in Madagascar, what's happening here? This is one example of one endangered species. There are many others, but we're going to look very in depth here. This is where I did my field work in Madagascar. It's this region of the area here. This is the region where most of the remaining rosewood trees in Madagascar still grow. They're pretty much exclusively located in the national park here. Rosewood used to cover the entire eastern seaboard. It was cut and logged during the colonial period, even before the colonial period, and then kind of stopped for a little bit in the 80s and 90s, and then experienced this rejuvenation because of Chinese demand. And especially since 2009, Madagascar experienced a coup d'etat, and this left effectively no official government, no formal government until 2013. And this triggered logging booms in the region's national parks. And so I lived here as a Peace Corps volunteer during the logging boom time, so in 2010, after the coup. And I saw the complete transformation of the area because of this logging happening. Here's an example at the highest level. At the highest levels of the trade, the people who controlled the export were using rosewood money to build these elaborate houses. People told me that anytime you had high walls in the town where I was living, you knew there was rosewood on the other side, and you knew that rosewood built these walls. And also, the exporters with the most connections who started in the trade the earliest, like this exporter here, his name is Jovatu, he began campaigning for a position in Madagascar parliament. And he, in fact, won and is now a member of parliament with direct ties to the president in Madagascar. And he used his rosewood money to do the campaign and to, once he became a member of parliament, to affect the trade, regulations on the trade from within the government. That's at the highest levels, kind of the impacts that we're seeing. At the lowest level, people who lived in the forest like this in Ragnala, they worked for the trade and they earned more money than they could through most other routes, most other economic employment opportunities the region had to offer. And they traveled by the thousands to National Park, the dark green area here, where most of the logging happened. Most of the logging efforts were concentrated. And if we zoom into this area here, we see a close-up of the park, the kind of white lines being arrows of the routes where the logs are sent to the coast. They're sent, the coasts are very rural villages. They don't have ports. They're just taken by smaller ships, the larger ships floating at the horizon to eventually go overseas to China, eventually to various routes. The logging camps in the forest, similar to that, and the logging is done with very basic manual techniques, axe, saws, ropes, to literally drag these logs out of the forest, through the hills to the coast. For the biggest logs, you can have up to 60 men pulling on a rope through the forest to take these logs out to the coast.
National park?
Yeah, national park, Nassau National Park. So what happens in the rural villages during the times of the logging boom is that there's so much money it kind of begins to overflow. And it's simply because these are places that aren't used to having so much money, that they don't have normal outlets to channel all that capital. Largely due to poor financial infrastructure, the banks are difficult to access, they're days away by foot or canoe. Credit is scarce to non-existent, and crime is rampant. And so having so much cash presents a bit of a liability. And what happens oftentimes is that money is spent as quickly as it's earned. And it's spent, this phenomenon of spending all one's money as quickly as it's earned is so prevalent there. And the name for it in Madagascar, they say, Mulamakarma, which translates literally as hot money. And it's become a notorious feature of the social landscape in the region during the rosewood boom, also during vanilla boom, another highly speculative commodity that leads to this hot money spending. So hot money, it can be spent through conventional routes, such as long nights at the bar, fancy motorbikes, bidding on women. But it also can be spent in more creative routes. And I heard many stories of various creative routes of spending one's money in terms of hot money. And this is kind of just one of the most crazy to me. This is, the top here is a photo from my field notes. It's a photo one of my friends drew for me as he told me the story of hot money spending. This very bizarre story of a man who glued the money that he made into chameleons that he found in the forest and sent them treated like money glued to their side. And so in the picture, my friend, he's trying to show me what it would look like for a chameleon to have money glued to his side. As I listened to him in disbelief. And when I asked him why did they do this? He just replied, there's no reason, they do it just to do it. And this is what happens during the boom times, when there's a lot of money flowing around and not a lot of productive investments, spaces for it to be invested, right? Money here is not being understood as capital, it's not being invested or saved as capital. Instead, people are managing this sudden injection of wealth in their own ways. And the region is overwhelmed with cash. And then eventually the military comes in and shuts down the logging for all except a connected few. And the international community plays a big part in this dynamic. The World Bank and the United Nations, they play a large part in this dynamic. And I think in the next section, I'm going to discuss kind of the international community response and this larger debate about protectionism and plantations and what to do about the rosewood trade and the trade in endangered species more broadly. So I think there's a debate, and there are two general approaches to rosewood conservation that I see happening internationally. And they're not mutually exclusive at all. You can pursue both of them, but usually it's one or the other that's emphasized. So the first is a protectionist approach. It's the more common approach. It's what's happening with rosewood in Madagascar, and internationally. It involves prohibiting the international trade and sending in the military to shut down the trade, and results in a type of militarized conservation dynamics. And in this section, I want to explore some of the unintended consequences of this approach and an alternative approach in terms of rosewood plantations. So here we see China's rosewood imports since 2000. In 2013, international trade in a number of rosewood species, including all those from Madagascar, was banned under CITES. It was listed under CITES Appendix 2. CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Basically, the international architecture for prohibiting or permitting trade in endangered species internationally. But it's no coincidence that after that listing, in 2014, rosewood imports to China and you can see coming from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, they peaked. In 2014, that was the year that the market was worth $26 billion US. Then in 2016, we have additional fighting prohibition and another increase, not quite as much as before. But this counterintuitive phenomenon of international trade restrictions boosting market prices and imports, as shown here, it's become known as the Madagascar phenomenon in Chinese timber trading circles. And they call it this because the trade restrictions on rosewood from Madagascar in 2013 had the biggest stimulating effect to the market. They increased market prices by over a magnitude. And this tendency, the Madagascar phenomenon, is known and discussed in Chinese timber trading circles quite a bit. In fact, this is a quote from the chairman of a classical furniture association, and he's referring explicitly to CITES, to these international trade restrictions here. He says the increased enthusiasm for rosewood has come mostly because of the release of new international regulations, referring to CITES. And so the result is that trade prohibition can end up increasing rather than decreasing the demand. They can backfire in this way in China. Also, on the supply side, in Madagascar, they have other unintended consequences. The speculative jolts to kind of buy while supplies last can cause increased logging moves on the ground in Madagascar. And also intensified logging moves, but also trigger this militarized response to dealing with the logging. And what happens, and I've been told this by people living in the region, how does it work with rosewood conservation, is the military comes in, it's very conspicuous, they come in, they drive down the road with their guns and in their trucks, and they come and they shut down the trains for basically everyone who's not connected to the capital, right? So we remember Douatu, and he's now a member of parliament. And what they would do is come in and shut down the train for everyone except people connected to, for example, Douatu. So it's more a monopolization than a complete shutdown of the trade. And so prices increase for those with the elite connections to continue to export the rosewood. Yes. So here we can see similarities between a war on poaching and the war on drugs, where criminalization empowers an elite minority and stigmatizes entire communities. And we're very aware of this dynamic when it comes to drug trafficking, but less aware of it when it comes to trafficking of endangered species. So this is some of the effects that I've seen and had told to me in Madagascar. And also during my research, I saw some other options for dealing with rosewood. This is a rosewood plantation in China. China is in fact pursuing some of these options, but mostly just within their own borders, right? In addition to importing large quantities of rosewood, China is also planting rosewood trees on a large scale. This is a rosewood plantation. This is a demonstration plantation set up by the government as a model for local investors. So we have governments engage the central government engaging in this type of rosewood conservation, but also local actors, investors, people who have made money from other things such as industry, other types of industry, textiles and whatnot, are beginning to invest in rosewood in this way. Yes, and so in Madagascar, we don't see this happening. We don't see, there's some rosewood plantations started by mostly Chinese Malagasy people who are investing to their families, for their children. We don't see large scale rosewood plantations at all, and certainly not being financed by Western conservation organizations operating in Madagascar. Instead, the money goes primarily to stopping the logging in this way that I explained. So So here we can see kind of a debate emerging, right? Should we wage war to protect the last remaining species, or should we plant the species anew? And of course, it's possible to do both. But typically the focus, as I see it in Madagascar, is on protection as opposed to planting. And I think that this isn't just about rosewood, it's a deeper divide around endangered species, how to conserve endangered species, but also how the environment in general, how to approach sustainability through a protectionist approach or through this kind of large-scale plantation approach, which really is transforming the environment in a way that's not protecting nature in any sense of the word. And so we have these two different paradigms. And in the book, I talk about this in much more detail in chapter 6, but here we can see kind of two different approaches to the environment. And I like to think of these slogans as ways that kind of encapsulate the difference that I see. Here we see this protectionist approach, save the planet, nature needs half, a movement to protect essentially half the world ecosystems, and this idea of preserving nature. And then on the other side, we see slogans that are emerging in China, environmental slogans that sound quite different. We see these slogans, build a beautiful China, construct an ecological civilization, build a beautiful China. This idea of building forests, and you talked about, is very common in China. It's a different way to imagine a forest and what its value is. And so these slogans differ at every step, right? Building and constructing versus saving and protecting, China and civilization versus nature and the planet. What I argue in the book is what we're seeing here is two different underlying philosophies when it comes to the environment and what to do about sustainability. And I don't want to imply that they're mutually exclusive. Again, they're not. They overlap quite a bit. But my point here is that if we think of environmentalism as a vast assemblage of ideas and practices, I would argue that the vast assemblage of environmental actions and beliefs that characterize environmentalism as pursued in the West is not the same as the vast assemblage of environmental actions and beliefs that characterize environmentalism in China. That they're overlapping, but also distinct in some distinct underlying philosophies that scholars of the global environment should be studying more and thinking about much more. And this is kind of the point. This is where we come to the global implications and the bigger stakes of what does the rise of global China mean when it comes to the environment. This global implication. What does this all mean? And I want to take a step back and think about what is global China? What does it mean for China to be global? When did this happen? I think China started to first be a global phenomena in the modern sense, right, in the contemporary sense, with perhaps we can take it back to when China joined the WTO in 2001. The event was really a momentous. I think everyone agreed that, according to the Secretary General of the UN at the time, it was an event of historic proportions and the People's Daily. It was a historic moment in China's reform and opening. So everyone agreed on the importance of this event, but its exact significance, especially for the future of globalization, was contested. Because in the West, there was little doubt that political and social reform would soon follow the economic in China. This quote really sums it up. This is a quote from George W. Bush. Back in 1991, he says, "No nation on earth has discovered a way to import the world's goods and services while stopping foreign ideas at the border. Just as the democratic idea has transformed nations on every continent, so too change will inevitably come to China," right? But is this what happened? Did the democratic idea transform China? No. I mean, in hindsight, we can all say no, definitely not. But at the time, this was definitely, I would say most people would agree with this statement, would have no question about this statement, that democracy was considered the telos for all of humanity, and that no country could prosper without it. So that was the kind of this first moment of, we wouldn't talk about global China yet. I think when we talk about global China now, it's really about the Belt and Road Initiative. So, going back to 2013, that's when it was launched. This is kind of what we mean about when we talk about global China in the present moment. It's really an unprecedented global investment plan, which China has partnered with no less than 140 countries to develop infrastructure and investment projects, potentially totaling up to $8 trillion by 2050, right? The initiative is often referred to as the New Silk Road, which is, of course, a reference to the old Silk Road, when China was also a global power. And in making this historical reference to the New Silk Road and igniting it with the old Silk Road, China is essentially alluding to deeper historical continuity, these new and old Silk Roads, while pushing the interstitial period of Euro-American hegemony into the background, right? So it's disrupting this narrative of Western-led globalization that we commonly think about. I think for the past 2 centuries, at least, global or cosmopolitan have in many ways meant Western. The Western is somewhat indistinguishable from the global in ways that perhaps we don't recognize so much. Like, for example, when you think of the Bretton Woods institutions as purely global institutions, but then forget their provincial origins in rural Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, when, a small resort town in East Coast America, during an unprecedented post-war period when the US was miraculously able to unilaterally set the global agenda. This is kind of how we have been thinking about the global in a lot of ways, and China is messing with this conflation. This is a quote from Xi Jinping just last year. He said, "The Chinese modernization has broken the myth that modernization equals Westernization, that a country can modernize without becoming Western." Whether or not you agree with it, many people do, I think, and many people think about this in this way, certainly within China, some without China. And I think the Belt and Road Initiative is a way for China to demonstrate this to other countries globally, to kind of offer, in its most ideal sense, to offer a model for another path forward that doesn't rely on the model of the West, in terms of how to modernize, in terms of how to develop. But I think if we think about this in terms of the environment, we can think of another parallel of kind of potentially offering this different vision for a sustainable future that's not based on nature protection in the same way the concepts romanticize in the West. We can think of this parallel and begin to think about, is that actually happening or not? And it makes us go back to this kind of dichotomy here that we have. And my experience in Madagascar leads me to believe that I think people in Madagascar are much more interested in this more building, constructive, like action-oriented type of sustainability. But yet see much more often this conservation focus. In fact, in Madagascar, they see primarily this conservation and protectionist focus. And so potentially you can see China offering a different model that is much more based on active building as opposed to preservationism. And I think the debates over global China ignore this potential and don't quite look at it, don't analyze it for what it is. When we talk about China instead, it's much more often in terms of this. This is what China is, right? This is China's transformation. This is Shanghai from 1990 and in 2010. The same area, right? The only thing that remains the same is this clock tower. This is the transformation that we know when we talk about China, right? We hear it all the time. It's the story that we hear of China. But this too is happening as well outside of the cities, arguably on a much larger scale. This is Hunan province in 2000 and 2010. And yeah, so we see this happening as well. An area of land equivalent to a quarter the size of the Amazon has become greener in this way in China. This is also from Nicholas's presentation. China plants more trees than the rest of the world combined. Here we see changes in forest area in 2015. So this includes most of this change that it's a result of afforestation and reforestation. And some from natural expansion, but most of it is human-made. But this type of change, right, this type of greening is very controversial. It's a type of large-scale ecological engineering that doesn't necessarily contribute to biodiversity or protecting wilderness. It's again with active building and constructing of forests and ecosystems. It's highly controversial. And my point here is not to say that it's better or worse, but that something different is going on here. And I think there's a potential to provide a different vision for a sustainable future. And a vision that might appeal to countries like Madagascar that are more interested in building in their environments than protecting them. Just here we have an article from Nature Sustainability in 2019, I think it was published, showing that greening happening in China. This annual average leaf area increases. You can see where they're happening, and it's happening at large scale. The article basically showed that it's happening in China more than any other country in the world during this time since 2000. We see the highest amount of greening. And I think, again, it's not that it's good, right? It's not to say it's good, but that it's something that's definitely a transformation that we need to be much more aware of and understand where it's coming from. And that liberal Western environmental governance that has dominated the past 3 decades is really ill-equipped to understand this transformation, both culturally and politically. And here, just to kind of illustrate that, this is a quote from a special issue on illiberalism and the environment. And I think it holds true. It said, liberal social theory of the environment offers little to explain the institutionalization or effectiveness of China's one-party, highly centralized authoritarian state in efforts to address that country's rapidly mounting environmental challenges and its role in global environmental governance. So I want to emphasize here the reality that the liberal social theory is profoundly limited in understanding this, but also to emphasize that China is in a unique position to demonstrate this possibility of building an environmental future that doesn't necessarily follow Western visions of sustainability that focus on protectionism in the same way, and have different understandings of how governance works, how liberal governance versus governance in China works. And so I will conclude here with this slide. I want to come back to the idea of repatriation. Because at the beginning of my book and this talk, we discussed the Chinese art thefts in the early 2000s, and they're part of a broader trend for demand for repatriation across the globe. And really also a broader trend of demands for decolonization. And we see a pushback from the global south about returning cultural artifacts, but also about governing endangered species and reclaiming environmental sovereignty. Questions are being raised much more forcefully than before, right? Who has the right to define the legality of trading in endangered species across borders? Who has the right to say what other countries can or cannot do with their resources? Many countries and many communities are pushing back against international laws and norms that privilege Western approaches to endangered species conservation or environmental protection more broadly. And they're pushing for other approaches based on sustainable use and harvest. And it's within this broader trend of pushing back against Western conservation efforts and decentering the West that I think we need to understand the implications of China's global rise within that broader trend. And from that vantage, we see China's global rise not only as a threat to endangered species, but also as a potential decentering of Western approaches to their conservation. Thank you.
I made a lot of comments. I was open to conversations, and then we can discuss everything that is in response, which is really interesting. So
Yeah, well, I like this. Well, thanks. I really enjoyed. Well, I really need to read the book. I got much more interested now, and definitely I'm gonna read it. Especially because I didn't know about the rosewood, and I think that there are possibly some similarities with some other species trade in between Brazil and China and other countries. Also, I think that is a interesting case that you think broadly on other regions and other issues that relate to Brazil and China as well. Something that I found very interesting is that the unexpected outcome of the policies in Madagascar to stop trade, which increases the price. And as like they told the drugs or other industries, if you have a very low supply and high demand, the price will skyrocket. And the few relief that it's already settled in the market probably will be good on that. And like the politician you mentioned. So this is something very interesting. And makes me think about like yesterday, I asked for you about how China is influenced or the influence of China influence globally the environmental issues or making the global more sustainable based on the Chinese premise of what is green environment or green development. And looking to this other things like what China brings, such as the rhino hornet or ivory, and these all have many environmental benefits and social benefits to local communities. I was reading a National Geographic magazine to tell you about the impacts of illegal trade. It's not kind of totally illegal, but it's emerging like illegal now because it's kind of a fund that grows in Afghanistan, I think so, or the Middle East country, that is illegal there to harvest, but each gram costs millions in the Chinese market, black market, because it is kind of a medicine or something like that. And there are many issues putting these funds in the break of extinction as well. And how China is getting more sustainable or putting itself on a stage of sustainable development, being a very hot spot of receiving system. If you use the Penicouple theory framework, it's a very hot spot of receiving system of endangered species.
I mean, I think like the picture that I showed, but also you showed in your presentation, like where it shows re-greening in China and this greening, but that's within the country borders, right? And they're not looking at its impact in places like Brazil with soybeans and other, like it's global impact. And I think if you look at that, it's a different story. But at the same time, what you do notice is that within China, there has been this kind of things are happening environmentally. And the question is, first of all, what does that process look like? How does it happen? But also, how will it change things outside of the country? Because I think it's going to. I don't know if the extent to which the transformation that has happened within China is going to, China is going to have any sort of positive impact in like Madagascar, for example, planting rosewood or not. But there is going to be this environmental transformation. China has plans and is already doing things that we're studying. It's very small, but in terms of promoting conservation outside of its borders. So it's just beginning to happen. It's very interesting, but I wouldn't cut it because I think they're, it's one of Xi Jinping's, one of the 6 principles of ecological civilization is to have the global ecological civilization. So they're trying to do that, and it will have impacts. And I think at the same time, China is, by using ecological civilization, trying to differentiate itself from Western countries in other ways too. But and I think it will have an influence on other countries.
Yeah, maybe this is a very interesting question for future studies to keep going. I mean, how this ecological civilization will impact the global trade of endangered species, global trade of endangered species. And we know that China is still a hotspot. And maybe things will change if the central government decides to do not be blind to the black trade and try to do something more effective. I believe that if the Chinese central government wants to do something, they are kind of able, they are maybe more able to do something compared to Brazilian standards. And if Lula decides to do something, maybe he wants, but he doesn't have the power that Xi Jinping has under his tentacles.
One example is with ivory, actually. The central government completely shut in 2018 or the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, they completely shut down the ivory trade. Internationally, it was not allowed, but they made domestic regulations to shut it down. And that, when you have strong domestic regulations, then the price of ivory falls because no one wants to hold on to the ivory because they know they can't sell it. With rosewood, it's the international regulations that don't match the domestic regulations. People think as soon as they get it into the country, it'll be okay. So the price really goes higher, in fact. But if you have domestic regulations, then it does. With ivory, the price of ivory has decreased since that time in 2018. And it really has had an impact, like a clear impact. But they don't want to do it with rhino horn and tiger bones. It's a complicated reason, in part because of the medicinal value of these animals, and in part because there is this question for captive breeding and sustainable use. That China really wants to, so China had a captive breeding of tigers is very controversial. But there's a desire within the country to have that, and there's a strong lobby from the people engaging in those industries to not shut it down like they did with ivory, to not have this. So it had with ivory, they tried to do it with rhino horn and tiger bone, but then it was like they tried to open up the trade, in fact, but there was such an international backlash. They changed it, and now it's in this liminal gray area, like where people who breed tigers are like freeze the carcasses of the animals that have died, waiting for this kind of waiting for it to open up, waiting to be able to sell it. It's the government has acted very differently with ivory than with rhino horn and tiger bone. And then rosewood is even more of a question because they have these plantations. They very much want to have sustainable use of rosewood and have that and have a whole scientific investigation in how to make the hardwood grow faster and how to have these plantations and whatnot. So rosewood is really a more liminal case where it's not as controversial to have rosewood plantations.
More tangible.
And they're doing it in China on a large scale. And it's one thing that's nice about this is one of the plantations they have, as we were saying before, the understory economy. So it's not central. It's not just the trees. It's also these other cultural goods like tea, honey, free-range chickens, medicinal herbs that they grow as well in the plantation spaces to provide kind of short-term returns to fund the long-term growth of the trees. Because the trees can be, if they're rosewood trees, they can be harvested earliest at like 20 years.
Yeah.
So it's an agroforestry.
Yeah, it's an agroforest, something
It's
like that.
like it's like agroforestry, but but they're really like what I've noticed in visiting them they are these like cultural goods that have like price premiums because like the teas
The tea growing under.
it's
It's
a
like the
very
coffee under forest or the cacao.
and it's part of the appeal to the investors who are investing in them. Like so we met George here and we met some investors, some people who own these plantations, and it has cultural appeal to them to invest in the type of cultural
Pride.
yeah, definitely. And so for the first one I think we talked to, he was initially going to do eucalyptus. And then they're going to define and plant eucalyptus because that's the majority of the region is covered with eucalyptus. And this has been a promotion by the government to change that because the eucalyptus rotation is like 3 to 5 years, I think. And then they cut it down. The government has been trying to get this region to engage in longer term plantation activities and not have. Yeah.
China is just owned the largest eucalyptus company in Brazil. Here in São Paulo State.
Yeah.
Bracel.
Yeah.
They are changing the land use in the entire state.
Yeah. With
In the
plants and
entire state.
eucalyptus.
Yes, it's the largest food plant in the world.
Huh.
Yeah, it's amazing. They are pumping water from Tietê River, which is 100 kilometers far from the country.
Yeah, so this is one from province you see there's eucalyptus, there's lots of eucalyptus being planted in the landscape. And this is an attempt by the provincial level of government in this case to switch and try to have less eucalyptus.
Yeah.
So that brings me well, first of all, thank you for the great presentation. Very concise and robust. I'm shocked because by the scale of this market, I would not never think about a 6-story mall.
More than one.
More than one.
Exclusively
Only
dedicated
for
to the sale.
rosewood products. Right? So, again, I would go back to the question I posed to Nicholas yesterday. Is the eco-civilization concept something for China or for the planet? Here is a typical case that it's not for the planet.
Yeah,
At least it has not been for the planet.
yeah.
And also you said that rosewood is a tropical wood, so does it grow well in China? How long would grow rosewood? How long would it take for these plantations to supply the internal market?
Yeah.
By the scale of this thing, the answer is never.
Yeah.
But of course, we can never say that never to China,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
But as we are talking about tree species,
Yeah.
we have to think about a time scale also for this process to happen. It's not like building skyrockets, skyscrapers in Shanghai. You can do it in 1 year or 2, not with trees.
No.
So again, I still am very skeptical about this ecological civilization concept, if it is for the planet.
Yeah. I think, yes, ecological civilization, I don't think it's good to think of it as it's for the planet. I think what's more compelling is it's an example not to follow, like, this is how to do ecological, like, China's unique. It has the strong state, it has all these unique features. It's not an example to follow, like, this is the blueprint for sustainability. But I think what it does do that I think is going to change things for the future is that it provides a model, not to follow, but just to show that there's this other way of doing things, doing conservation. And it's like Xi Jinping's thing, westernization doesn't have to be, or modernization doesn't have to be westernization. Like that's,
I'm okay with that.
but I think that's powerful. Like, I think it's powerful because, well, again, I come from a conservation background. I've studied it since, all throughout my undergraduate, master's, whatever. I studied it. I came to this without knowing anything about China before, like, and it was all new to me. I didn't, but I've been basically talking about endangered species conservation for, a decade, but I don't know, really, I didn't know what was happening in China, what was causing the demand, like so much about it I didn't know, because it's an isolated community. I think that the conservation, like working at Madagascar, the international conservation groups have a particular way of thinking, and they think that what they're doing is a global thing. It's not, or it's not Western. You wouldn't think of it, they wouldn't think of it, and I wouldn't think of it before, honestly, as like, this is Western conservation. No, it's just conservation. Or this is Western environmentalism. No, it's just environmentalism. But I think if you reflect, and then you look at what China's doing, and reflect on it both politically, but also socially and culturally, you begin to see, oh, it is a little bit Western environmentalism, what we're doing, and there is something else, and not that it's totally different. Like, because China's legal structure environmentally is very much inspired by the United States. Many things are very much inspired by the United States environmentally in China, but some things are different. It's like how China uses capitalism, uses economics that comes from neoliberalism, uses that, but deploys it in a very different way. So like China's capitalist, yes. It's also communist, it also has a very different government. So it's a different, there's some similarities, there's drawing from this Western playbook, but then there are different things. And I think it can really inspire countries that, like in Madagascar, that honestly have low opinions of Western countries intervening in their spaces.
Maybe it is economically capitalist, but
Yeah.
politically communist.
Yes, but even economically, yes, sure, but like putting limits on private companies and arresting their CEOs or whatever, like all these things, there's the overlap, right? The economic is not just in its own thing, but yes, economically it can thrive. Economically it's capitalist, but yet the economic in China is always subordinate to the political. And the environmental in China is also always subordinate to the political in the same way. But in the US, the economy is not subordinated to the political in the same way. It's not. It's very different.
I have a lot of comments. Because my background is in consumption and environmental psychology. And then it comes to me, like, it's interesting every time I use ecological as a term to the environment.
Yeah,
Because ecological has also the meaning of restrict information or restrict something. Ecological means to diminish something. And it means that you're supposed to have a consumption society with less. This is not happening. Like, for me, it's interesting that all the lands increase the price of which roads would, because it's a luxury that China is trying to build lands for themselves. Like, they are trying to figure out how luxury can be translated to Chinese, which means that for the Europeans, for French, it's French goods. But for China, what is it? And for me, sustainability is really connected to consumption begin. we can discuss politics, we can discuss economics, but our behavior independent if you are in a Western country, Eastern country, East-Asian consumption, what you consume dictates or show to others what are food, right? We don't dress ourselves regardless of what thinking about us. So what we consume, and this is the reason of shopping, because they can, like you can go to Japan and you can see the same things with other groups, and they are always trying to find. And the plantation for me is just something they're trying, but they're skeptical because if it is success, if it has a success, it means that the price for those will decrease.
Yeah.
So they will have to find another luxury good.
Is they going to be like something else enough?
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, yeah, what is the intention of the government regarding the plantation?
Yeah.
Just, I don't know, like, just to decide the fact that they are not going to forbid rules inside the country.
Yeah.
And another thing that you mentioned is because, in regards to globalization. Globalization for me is the same of revolution. It just means that you're changing. And if it is an improvement or not, it depends on your point of view or perception of the change.
So they told us this metamorphosis.
But it's the same thing, like, it depends on your point of view.
Different than evolution.
Yeah.
Well, that's what
But
I said.
globalization is
right?
like that, because if you recall, like, if you pay attention to the industrial revolution in the beginning of the 20th century, it improved the lives, but right now, when we look back, it really improves. Like, in what terms? Like, the consequence of that industrial revolution we are facing right now. So it depends on your point of view, of time. Some of the condition, it doesn't mean that you're for certain you are getting an improvement, especially when we are talking about consumption in our society. Because our society is based upon consumption. And another thing is the building forests. We humans, we have this capacity because for sure we are lost in biodiversity. Because it can be used as a justification for deforestation today, like I can build the forest in the future, so it's not a problem to lose the biodiversity right now, but when you do something that you don't know, how can you build it in the future? And Germany is an example of that. Most of the forests in Germany are beautiful forests. It's not, they lost the biodiversity. You know, I think George Bush was very wrong a long time. That was my comment. He was.
Maybe not only about time.
The United States usually see the other countries. They think that they can push the other governments to do what they do, or what they want them to do, right? And I think China learned that very well in the US. This is what they are doing. When I was living in Japan and I was traveling in the Southeast Asia, right, Philippines, Singapore, all these countries, you can see the digital power of China on these countries, especially for food consumption. And my question to you is like, it's regarding the endangered species that use this consumption market. Like water is an endangered resource, right? So the soil needs this. Which resource is not endangered? Because of consumption. Even energy, if we think about it. So our eager to consume things that are luxury or special to consume ourselves and others is making this whole climate change more messier. I don't know if you agree with me.
Yeah, so I want to go back to kind of the first city codes. We brought up a lot of things about the plantations and like if they're successful, the price would be fine. And then like I mean, yes, that's right. The people who acted early, these investors who act early with plantations, they got good deals. They got good deals on land. You know, they will make money. And when we spoke to them, they were all getting returns. They had offers to buy their land. Then they would say, no, buy their plantation, buy their operations. And they say, no, we don't want to do that because we think we can make a lot of money off of this and more money. But I think it's like most of the land in this area is used for eucalyptus. So this, and they're like, look at the price of eucalyptus. It's used to make cardboard pulp for packaging to send stuff, right? So that's very low margins, very low margin. This is higher margins than that. These margins will be, they're high margins now, and they will certainly decline as things become more competitive. And then it's not possible to feed the whole market demand for sure with these trees. But it's an attempt of the government to change the land use from eucalyptus to something that they see as better for the water supply, for the environment in that region. Also has climate impacts as well. So it's an attempt to do that, to again transform the landscape in this way that's economically viable and also more sustainable than eucalyptus than what the land has been used for before. But I brought up two. Just the idea of consumption being very important. Another thing I want to point out in terms of this is that, like as I said about the cultural history and the cultural revolution in China, the people buying rosewood are the people who lived through the Cultural Revolution, have the living memory of the Cultural Revolution. Younger people in China now don't care about rosewood that much. They don't care about all these endangered species as much. The question I think to ask is it just because they're young and like as they get older they'll care more, or is it a generational thing too? And I think it's both. I mean, and when I talked to the rosewood the people working in the industry, I asked them about this because they must be concerned about their market if young people don't want to buy rosewood. And a lot of them say, well, a lot of them are just like business people. They're like, we'll do whatever market, if rosewood isn't, we'll go to trade something else. We don't really care what it is. But others will be like, no, they'll get into it. When they get older, they'll get into it. They'll get, and I think before I was thinking that the young people it will totally change, but now I don't know if it'll totally change. But it'll be less. It'll definitely be less. And also with the young people in consumption, the whole issue of the environment is an issue for urban youth in China. It's an issue. Like we did a survey about wildlife consumption in China. The amount of people who responded to the survey wanting to ban all wildlife consumption in China surprised me. It was more than 50% of the. It was mostly urban residents. There was some rural, but it was from all over the country, like provinces from all over were represented. Anyway, it was a surprise to me. It was surprising the amount of people who didn't want to have wildlife consumption. Rosewood, I think, is different because it is so iconic. It is like in buying rosewood, it's not being Western. It's not buying Louis Vuitton handbags. It's buying rosewood furniture, right?
The reason that I think like the young people right now, in the future, when they get older, they really start.
Yeah.
They feel this connection.
Yeah.
Culture that they lost during the youth.
That is
very interesting. It's the same thing in the Middle East. Is the same thing because they tend to go back to some cultural roots and things like that. So we connect with the
like with the Hans Yeah, like, there's like the uptake of Chinese traditional clothing wearing.
In Japan, it's the same.
Yeah,
Right. Model,
We saw it with Liberdine, we're
Yeah.
getting some people dressed up in Giselle, that's very interesting to see that here as well. Because there's
In
no.
Japan, it's the same thing, like, women will not dress only in daily life, right?
Yeah.
But when they start to get older, they get married. And suddenly they are in the shops buying. Because one of the very expensive item. And also, it's something that you see yourself in the office.
One of the really interesting things about visiting some of these plantation members in China, and I think I never thought about it before, but they saw what they were doing as an investment, but also as a genuinely activity. And it's like culturally significant. They're like, the fact that they were raising rosewood and tea and some of these other medicines. They were coming from industrial production, textile factory owners and other manufacturing owners, and they saw it. So they saw kind of production as a form of consumption as well, because they were now casting themselves as these sort of traditional, gentlemanly farmers, which has its own cultural value and cachet. And I was very surprised by that. How they saw themselves,
But it's like the same as a farmers.
Yeah.
It's not like organic farmers, they will tell you, well, I'm not just doing agriculture, I'm doing something for the environment, for society. And the funny thing is that they put that in the price of the products. So my product is
That's
not
not-
something equals to the product in the supermarket. Because I'm doing this, so there is the price that is different and it's higher.
Or like in US, soybean and corn producers, even producing soybean every year, which is more profitable than corn, they still say, I am a corn producer. Because corn is beautiful, it's tall, it's a national pride. And soybean is something, is a foreign crop. So they don't say, like in Brazil, they say, well, I'm a soybean producer.
Yeah.
But in the US, they are just, maybe, but soybean is okay for Brazilian farmers. But in the US, they are corn producers. Look my corn plantation.
A colleague of us says, Emilio, he said that an American would never take a picture in front of a soybean.
Yeah, but the entire family.
But always in front of a corn.
Yeah, they're possible there.
That's really interesting thinking about your comments combined in terms of what modernization in that sense means. We talk about it as ecological modernization or like an ecological civilization of process. I was thinking when you said modernization means change, but does it only mean change? Because I think when we go back to like sociological conceptualizations of modernization, it often came with this colonial mode of production and consumption, also showing that you're able to consume tea from India, for example. It was a very colonial product and it showed your stoking styles in that sense. If we think about what is happening in China and how they're changing it to wanting to produce something that people do want to connect with. People who have lived through the horrors, I think that slide of the Cultural Revolution showed a little bit of how brutally things were destroyed in the attempt to break with history, the very long continuous history. I think there is now like this, I see it like that, I don't know, this small but very interesting, very qualitatively interesting movement of people wanting to do things differently, like you said, like it's a gentlemanly act, it's the right thing to do, producing those things that we would like to have in an ethical and ecologically more correct manner. And then that means being modern, consuming products that are not linked to deforestation, that are not linked to the extinction of a species that we highly appreciate. So I think there are lots of interesting ideas in terms of that, as well as what we see as desirable, as modern, as culture, as the culture we want to aspire to be.
I think it will be very hard to reach sustainability without changing consumption behavior. Because the way that we consume, and this is from the globalization, because it was the beginning of the global markets, and it was the beginning of consumption way of living, not only for your needs, but also for your desire and what you want to accomplish in life. And because of that, I know that there are endangered species. I'm not saying that they not exist, but everything is in danger. The planet is in danger because we cannot resource this consumption, even for the quantity of water that we have. So, regardless the motives that we consume something, the quantity is the important factor.
Yeah.
Because I don't use plastic cups anymore, but I sense every time there a big cup in the store. And then I just find to myself that it's okay to buy another one because I'm not using any more plastic. So the reason is that we are always allowing ourselves to continue to consume, even organic food, anything that you try to diminish or decrease environmental impacts. But the fact that we learn it to consume as a habit, it is. And I think China is just changing how to consume their own terms.
Absolutely. Certainly not challenging the question of consumption. I mean, that is, but I think absolutely no country. I don't think there's, and if any country were to do that, it would, I think China could be one of the, I don't think it's going to, mostly because I think the Communist Party legitimacy is based on economic growth at this point. Undermining consumption would undermine that, and that's the biggest issue. But if the legitimacy of the Communist Party were to be based more on environmental things, which is beginning to, or a little bit, then if any country is going to do it, I would say China could be one of, is much more likely than the Netherlands or the United States. From living in those two countries, but I think no country is doing that. I think no country is doing that, and it was simply because it's not. There's no catastrophic crisis making it happen. In the absence of that, I just don't think it's going to happen. Like, and consumption, yes, will continue. But about the tree, like the biodiversity you mentioned, and I think biodiversity is a big issue here in terms of tree planting. And in Madagascar, it's the reason why nobody wants rosewood plantations. They all want to protect the forests intact because of biodiversity. And I think in China, there are key iconic endangered species that are related to biodiversity, like tigers, like pandas, like rosewood. The China actually, China's very good at panda conservation because it involves captive breeding. They've done it far better than the U.S. has done. The U.S. has tried to breed pandas for a long time and failed, and then China managed to do it. So China's good at biodiversity in a certain way, but then also when thinking about these tree planting projects, they're not about biodiversity at all. They're about different things in different parts of the country. In the South here, it's about changing the forest landscape from eucalyptus production to a longer term production, set of species, agroforestry system, whatever. In the North, it's very much about desertification and reducing dust and pollution that's coming into Beijing. It's very just huge amount of money and finances and tree planting has gone into trying to transform the landscape of the North so that air pollution in Beijing is small. Huge amount of money. And it's like that. It's been highly unsuccessful in some places. but they're getting better at it, but it's very difficult. It's a very difficult task. But it's not about biodiversity at all. And like here, it's really not about like in most places in China, it's not about biodiversity. It's about pollution. It's a little bit about climate change, and it's about water and these more immediate things. And I think in part because biodiversity as a value does come from a more protectionist approach.
But there is another way to see tree plantations as a good maybe a positive way to culture biodiversity. And if you see the São Paulo state example, we can say that thanks to the eucalyptus plantation in the state of São Paulo, we still have many remnants of natural vegetation of the Atlantic forest. Why? Because for eucalyptus plantations here needs to be certified by the FSC because most of the plantations are to produce pulp, so as pulp for paper production.
Yeah.
And it's traded outside. So you have to be in compliance, the farm need to be in compliance with the forest code.
Yeah.
So if you have a farm, you need to have at least 20% of its own land covered by natural vegetation. If you wanted to have the certification, if you have the eucalyptus in your farm and you supply the factories, you need to have at least 20% of your farm covered by natural vegetation. So this is one point. The another point is the eucalyptus are important for coal, for tools, for buildings. And as long as we have now a very large supply of eucalyptus, no one is cutting more natural vegetation to use for other purposes because eucalyptus there is a supply enough to cover all the needs that we need in state of São Paulo. So eucalyptus is not necessarily building biodiversity, but it's helping to decrease the pressure over what we have as natural vegetation plants, which are more biodiversity.
But then we were using a soil, a land that it was not forest. For the
Yeah.
location. My problem with building forests is that, like in Germany, they were trying really to build a forest. Go back to the biodiversity that they had. Once that build walls, once that its biodiversity is lost, it's impossible to go back because we don't know what was.
Yeah. But that's the case in China thousands of years. I mean, like China is a highly developed landscape. Like to go back to what it was like in China, it's meaningless.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thousands of years.
Yeah, it's meaningless.
I mean, and in Germany too, probably on some, not as much as China on some level. Well, yeah, it's also, but then in Brazil, of course, it's not.
Yeah, it's different.
Yeah.
It's
It's
another
very
history.
different. Yeah.
The government told me learned the importance of
Oh, like
forests during the Romanticism after everything had come down.
Yeah.
Then we got this like, okay, now we need to be naturalists and go out into the forest and experience it. It's all, none of those forests are endemic, real forests.
No.
My point is that even when you have positive points that you were facing before, it's not enough to justify the thinking that, okay, if we lose, somehow we can restore. We cannot restore, we don't have the knowledge to restore. And the fact that most of the population, and then we have to think about what the population is seeing of that. Because if they do not recognize that we cannot restore these things, they will continue to push the demand for these products. And then the land that right now is being used for eucalyptus will be not enough.
But just to point out something, a difference that I've noticed is that this preoccupation with restoration, like this landscape will be lost, we won't have it again. It's not a problem for a lot of people. Yeah.
For the whole population, even climate change is not a problem that they are concerned. And it's happening.
Well, climate, I mean, the threat of climate change and the flooding, extreme weather events, those are a problem for people like that. But the idea that the landscape will be unaltered in a way that we can never return to might not necessarily be a problem.
Even if we wish,
But even people with
regulation degraded.
But even someone with an environmental sensibility, like pollution is a problem. It's getting in China because there isn't that landscape that is idealized, it's not, environmentalism in China is not about that. It's not about bringing back a landscape or just losing a landscape. It's about dealing with pollution. It's about very clear I think
It's making
But I-
urban area more clean.
making more clean, making, stopping flooding, stopping dust storm, very,
I
Yeah.
just think it is like, because we have to go back to many of the books. There is this dictionary for environment, Oxford, and
yeah.
when we are talking about pollution is not only air pollution, water pollution. Pollution is also something that is chronic, and you cannot go back to the stage that was before. So air pollution means that you cannot have the atmosphere that you had before. You install it, and then you have to deal with that. This is what they are trying to do in Beijing, because it's terrible. I would say before their initiative is totally
Yeah.
right. The same thing happens when you lose an environment like some parts of the Amazon that we are using right now, and you don't know what's there, and you will never know what's there. Even when we talk about the oceans, we are talking about micro and plastic. So pollution is more than air pollution, water pollution. Pollution is the fact that we have changed so much the environment that this difference that happened will be there for a long time. And I think the population, they don't know that. They have so very straightforward problems to deal with, like salary, rent, paid energy bills, that all the problems that we are talking about are not really, it's not a point of concern for them.
Yeah.
It should be very good that, here you have many neighbors quarrel. I mean, neighbors sometimes fight with each other because one neighbor has a large tree in our sidewalk, and in winter times, we lose the leaves. And the neighbors say, well, this is dirty, this is pollution. And they call sometimes the mayor, city hall, the environmental agency to say, well, I need someone to come see this. My neighbor's tree is polluting my swimming pool. And these days, my neighbor has a pool, which is behind my house. And I had a tree that in the winter lose completely its leaves. And these days I was in the sidewalk, cutting the grass, and he came to me indirectly saying, this tree is tall now, right? And now my pool is every day full of flowers and leaves. Every day. It's really difficult to keep clean. And I said, wow, but it's beautiful, right? He's from the Rutland. So it's crazy because I think that for many people that was set apart from nature for some reason. I mean, urban people, really urban people. For them, I think that the idea of environment or ecology it's the river that crosses your city or the air that you breathe. This is environmental issues because are the issues that you face every day, that you feel. But if you say, well, biodiversity, which is more related to clean oceans or natural forest, large forest areas, this is another word.
Yeah.
This is don't touch me. So I don't get conscious or aware about.
Yeah.
Which there is term for that in environmental psychology. And it is dissonance of time and space. So if it is not happening in my time or in my space, I don't bother. And this is the reason that it's not an environmental problem for those who are paying for it. It is a cultural problem, it's I don't know, point price problem, if it's too expensive, it's not expensive, but it's not related to the environment.
Yeah. Well, I think we should wrap things up, but I want to say a short little anecdote about that. But, George's uncle, actually, I asked him, because I just come back from Madagascar, I think, and I was in China, and I'm like, he had African rosewood, like a whole set. And I was talking to him, and I'm like, doesn't it make you sad that like this tree won't be in Madagascar? Like they're rosewood, at least at a certain age, will probably be gone from the forest. Of course, there will be many younger trees that aren't commercially viable. But he's like, no, I mean, first of all, he got excited because of the investment potential. He's like, really, there aren't that many left, He was very excited. But also, it's like, it's realizing its greater form in the form of being sculpted into beautiful furniture that will last for generations to come. It's a better place for rosewood to be. And I think to me, it's totally different value systems regarding the tree. Is it an endangered species that needs to be protected, that is a symbol of nature, or is it a symbol of cultural development and cultural progress that needs to be turned into furniture and kept for generations to give to your youth? It's a very contentious tree because it embodies so much symbolically different landscapes that it's hard to understand the viewpoint of the other. Yeah. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I really appreciate the whole discussion, and I think we can see that different disciplines can really integrate each other to try to figure out this complex problem regarding sustainability in human society, which is very complex, and how we behave inside this environment, inside this planet, in integrated or separated. Right? Well, thank you so much. And thank you.
Thank you.
Are you aware of the Brazilian rosewood story?
Yeah. Oh, is there a particular? I mean, I'm aware.